My name is Nathan Cole, and back in the 90s, I was a 29-year-old lawyer sharing a cramped office on the fourth floor of an old downtown building, still hungry enough to take almost any case that walked through the door. I didn't have my own practice yet. I had a desk, a law degree, and an old-timer named Aaron Weiss, who let me split his space in exchange for splitting the rent. What I also had, whether I wanted it or not, was a front row seat to watching one of the worst human beings I have ever met slowly destroy his own empire, and I got to help. Let me tell you about the building first, because the building is basically a character in this story. It was ancient, marble floors worn smooth by decades of shoes, brass elevator doors that stuck if you didn't hit the button exactly right, and in the basement there was a relic from another era entirely, a massive, riveted steel bank vault, the kind you only see in old movies, left behind from back when the building used to house an actual bank branch. Nobody had bothered to rip it out. Instead, somebody had gotten creative. The basement had been turned into a restaurant, and the vault itself, this 100-ton monster of steel, had become the restaurant's private dining room. You'd eat dinner surrounded by rows of gleaming, empty safe deposit boxes, with a massive circular door swung halfway open like a movie prop. They called the place the Vault. It fit. I ate there constantly, partly because the pasta was incredible and partly because it was 2 floors down from my desk. I knew the owner, a warm, exhausted-looking man named Marco DeLucci, well enough that he just nodded at me and asked if I wanted the usual. And looming over the entire building, every tenant, every lease, every square foot of it, was our landlord. His name was Gerald Vance. If you'd asked anyone in that building to describe him in one word, you would have gotten the same answer from about 90% of them: asshole. Vance was a big man, built like someone who'd done manual labor in his youth and stopped moving entirely in his middle age, with a permanent red flush in his cheeks and a voice that carried through walls, whether you wanted to hear it or not. He owned 3 buildings downtown and ran every single one of them like his own personal kingdom. Rent hikes came without warning. Maintenance requests vanished into a black hole. And whenever a tenant so much as questioned him, Vance had a favorite move, and he loved pulling it out. He'd remind you, loudly, gleefully, that in this state, a commercial landlord doesn't need a court order to lock you out. All he needs is a locksmith and an afternoon. Cross him, annoy him, fall a little behind, and you could show up on a Monday morning to find your key didn't work anymore, with your entire business sitting on the other side of a door you no longer had access to. He threatened it constantly. He'd threatened me and Aaron twice that year alone, once over something as pathetic as who was responsible for replacing a hallway light bulb. I'd learned to just nod, stay quiet, and let Aaron, who'd survived 30 years of landlords exactly like this, handle the theatrics. But that was about to change, because Marco was about to become the reason I stopped being a bystander. It was a Tuesday. I came down for my usual lunch, and Marco met me at the host stand himself, which was never a good sign. Marco only did that when something was wrong. "The landlord's driving me nuts," he said, guiding me to a table in the back. "The landlord drives everyone nuts," I said, only half joking. He didn't laugh. He sat down across from me and slid a folded piece of paper across the tablecloth like it was contaminated. It was a formal demand letter, Vance's signature bullying style, dressed up in legal language itemizing a laundry list of outstanding expenses he claimed Marco owed: snow removal fees, parking lot resurfacing, common area flooring charges. Some of it stretched back years. It read less like an invoice and more like a shakedown, and it ended, like every one of Vance's letters did, with a not-so-subtle reminder that failure to comply could result in the locks being changed. "You do something to piss him off more than usual?" I asked, because this is aggressive even for him. Marco rubbed his face with both hands. He knows I'm moving the restaurant. New space, better foot traffic, actual sunlight instead of one sad basement window. I signed a new lease last month. I think he found out and decided to squeeze every dollar he could out of me before I go. "And the vault?" I asked, already knowing that was the real problem. His jaw tightened. "That's the part that's going to bury me. He's not just squeezing me for cash. He's holding the entire move hostage." I told him to send the lease up to my office so I could actually read it before either of us said another word. An hour later, a thick envelope landed on my desk, and the deeper I got into it, the worse it looked. This wasn't a clean, modern contract. It was a lease sitting on top of a lease sitting on top of an assignment of a lease, stretching all the way back to the years right after World War II, when a bank had first taken the space and installed that vault as a permanent fixture. Somewhere in that long, tangled chain of paperwork, some previous tenant had agreed to a clause that said whoever eventually vacated the space had to remove the vault, entirely 100 tons of riveted steel, and restore the room to what it looked like before there had ever been a bank there at all. That I sat back and did the math in my head. Cranes, structural engineers, permits, disposal fees for something the size of a small house. This would cost a fortune, and that was before I even flipped to the last page. And on the last page was the part that turned this from Marco's problem into Marco's personal financial ruin. A guarantee clause. Marco himself, not some shell company that could just fold and disappear. Marco, personally, on the hook for pulling a 100-ton vault out of a basement and restoring the room behind it. If he walked away and left it there, Vance had every legal right to come after him personally and chase his assets for years. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. There was no clean legal argument here. I ran through the obvious ones in my head. Statute of limitations, unconscionability, some kind of estoppel angle, and none of them held up cleanly enough to bet Marco's entire financial future on. If this went to court the honest way, Marco was going to lose, and lose badly. But I hadn't gotten into contract law because I liked losing. I thought about Vance, the threats, the petty rent hikes, the light bulb argument, the way he talked to every tenant in that building like they should be grateful he let them exist in his presence. And somewhere in the back of my mind, an idea started clicking into place, piece by piece, like a lock finding its combination. I called Marco. "I'm screwed, aren't I?" he said the second he picked up. "You're calling to tell me there's no way out. My other lawyer already told me the same thing, but go ahead, hit me." "I can get you out of this," I said, "but it's going to cost you." There was a pause. "How much?" "5,000 for my time. Another 1,000 cash for an agent I'm going to hire." "Agent? What kind of agent?" "Real estate agent. Send the check up, certified, and don't ask me any questions for the next few days. Just trust me." He didn't hesitate long. A courier delivered a certified check to my office within the hour. That's how badly he wanted out. I walked straight into Aaron's side of the office. He was leaned back in his chair, reading glasses low on his nose, going through a stack of mail that looked like it hadn't been touched in a week. "I need a real estate agent," I said. He didn't even look up. "You buying a house?" "Nope." "Selling one?" "Nope." He finally lowered the papers and studied me over the top of his glasses. 5 years of sharing an office meant Aaron could read me pretty well by then. "You're pulling one of your stunts." "I am. Gonna get me in trouble." "Not even a little." He grunted, reached into his desk drawer, and pulled out an ancient leather Rolodex that honestly belonged in a museum. He flipped through it with the practiced speed of a man who'd built half his career on favors instead of billable hours, and stopped on a card. "I know a guy," he said, and slid it across the desk. Aaron always knew a guy. It's actually one of the reasons his own legal career eventually hit some turbulence, but that's a story for another day. Right then, his Rolodex was exactly what I needed. The next morning I sat across from the agent, a smooth-talking man named Dominic Reyes, who specialized in commercial leasing, and laid out exactly what I needed. It wasn't complicated, technically. It just required precision and a very specific paper trail. I needed him to draft something that looked like a genuine letter of intent from a serious prospective tenant, say, a bank or a credit union interested in leasing the basement space specifically because it already had a working, secure, historic bank vault installed, a space that would save them an enormous amount of money on installing their own. The letter needed to be real enough to survive a glance. Professional letterhead, believable financial terms, genuine market language, but baked into the fine print, it needed one crucial quality. It had to be entirely non-binding. Nothing enforceable. Nothing that obligated anyone to actually sign a lease, ever. It was bait, shaped exactly like something Gerald Vance would find irresistible. Dominic listened to the whole plan, nodded slowly, and smiled the smile of a man who appreciated elegant work when he saw it. "That's a hell of an idea." He said I need it fast. I told him, and handed over the cash. 3 days later, it was ready. But I didn't send Vance the fake letter first. The bait needed a trap built around it before it went anywhere near his desk. First, I needed to lock him into a position he couldn't retreat from once that letter appeared. I drafted a formal demand letter on Marco's behalf. On the surface, it looked routine, a tenant exercising his right under the lease to remove trade fixtures and equipment before vacating. Ovens, refrigeration, ventilation systems, plumbing fixtures, all things the lease explicitly allowed him to take. But buried in that same demand was a second item, a formal request that Vance also release the bank vault itself and permit its removal within 7 business days. I mailed it, and I waited out. A few days later I went down for lunch. Same as always. Marco met me at the door, pale as a sheet. "He's here," he whispered. "The landlord. Having lunch. In my restaurant." "Perfect," I said. "Let's sit in the vault room, so at least you don't have to look at him." We settled into the private table inside the actual vault. Door pulled almost fully shut. Rows of old safe deposit boxes gleaming under the dim light. A waiter brought carbonara and a bottle of red, and I pulled a folded copy of the demand letter out of my briefcase. "We're making a formal demand," I said, sliding it across. Marco scanned it, brow furrowing. "The lease already lets me take the kitchen equipment. Nobody's arguing that. The only thing that actually matters here is the vault, and I don't want the vault. That's the whole problem." "You need the vault," I said, twirling pasta onto my fork. "We're demanding he release it, insisting he let you remove it within 7 business days." He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You think you can beat this guy with reverse psychology? You think demanding something loudly enough makes him hand it over out of spite?" "We're about to find out. He's had the letter for 2 days." His wine glass slipped out of his hand and shattered on the marble floor. He shoved the vault door the rest of the way open and called for a waiter to clean it up, his face somewhere between panicked and furious. "Trust me," I said, standing, brushing off my jacket. "Come on. Let's go say hello." We walked into the main dining room, where Gerald Vance sat alone at his usual table, tearing into a rack of lamb with both bare hands, grease glistening on his fingers, completely unbothered by anyone around him. I stopped at his table. "My client needs an answer today," I said. "I sent you a demand a few days ago. He needs the vault removed on schedule. He's got arrangements to make." Vance looked up slowly, chewing, clearly enjoying making us wait. "Your client," he said, wiping one greasy hand on a napkin that had already given up trying to help him, "can forget about the vault." I let my jaw drop, feigning shock with everything I had. Beside me, Marco's genuine shock did the acting for both of us. "You can't do that," I said. "That vault is explicitly—" He cut me off with a booming laugh loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. "I'm the landlord. I can do whatever I want." "I'm going to need that in writing," I said, keeping my voice flat, professional, almost bored, "because my client may have to sue." "Sue all you like," he said, waving a greasy hand. "Sue till you're blue in the face, counselor. You'll have my written response by end of day. Now get out of my restaurant, I'm eating." I nodded once, turned, and walked out, fighting to keep the smile off my face the entire way. The letter showed up at my office that same evening, exactly as promised. Blunt, arrogant, and, most importantly, official. In writing, on letterhead, with his own signature at the bottom, Gerald Vance formally asserted ownership and control over the bank vault, refusing to release it to the outgoing tenant under any circumstance. I brought it downstairs immediately and slid it across the bar to Marco. "How the hell did you do that?" he asked, staring at it like it might disappear if he blinked. "Trade secret," I said, and ordered a glass of wine to celebrate something he didn't fully understand yet. Because here's the piece Marco hadn't been letting on. Vance's refusal to release the vault meant he was now on record, in his own handwriting, essentially, claiming that the vault belonged to him, not to the outgoing tenant, which meant legally the burden of removing it, the obligation to restore the space, all of it, now sat squarely on the landlord's shoulders, not Marco's. Marco didn't have to lift a finger. No cranes, no engineers, no fortune he didn't have. He just needed to move out on schedule, hand back his keys, and let a document Vance had signed himself do all the heavy lifting. The following month, the restaurant packed up and relocated across town. They kept the name, the Vault, and did their best to recreate the old atmosphere. It worked, mostly, except for one thing. The actual vault, all 100 tons of it, stayed exactly where it had always been, in the basement of Vance's building, now legally his responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. I showed up to the office a few days after the move, and Aaron practically ambushed me at the door. "Vance is looking for you," he said, grinning like a man who already knew exactly what had happened without needing the details. "He is pissed." "What about?" "Says his deal fell through." I raised an eyebrow, doing my best impression of a confused bystander. "What deal?" "Something about a new tenant for the basement. A bank or a credit union. He said they were all set to sign a lease, and just never showed." "Huh," I said. "Weird. I heard the exact same story, word for word, 2 days later, except this time it came straight from Vance, cornering me in the lobby, his face red enough to match the marble floor. "I know you were behind this," he snapped, jowls shaking with every word. "I know it was you. That offer, from that agent, it was fake. A trick. You wanted me to keep insisting I owned that vault, so your restaurant client could walk away clean and leave it for me to deal with." I folded my arms, the picture of calm. "If you're looking for legal counsel on this matter, I'm afraid I'll have to declare a conflict of interest." His face went a shade darker. "I'm suing. I'm suing the restaurant. I'm suing that agent. And I'm suing you." He stormed toward the elevators, nearly shouldering past 2 other tenants on his way. But he never sued. Of course he didn't. There was nothing to sue on. The letter of intent Dominic had drafted was airtight in its own quiet way, vague enough to hook a greedy man, explicitly non-binding, incapable of being enforced without a formal signed lease that never existed and never would. Any lawyer he consulted would have told him the exact same thing. No contract, no breach, no case. Just a landlord who'd been so eager to squeeze one more advantage out of a tenant that he'd talked himself directly into a trap of his own making, in writing, with his own signature at the bottom. 100 tons of steel sat untouched in that basement, in a space that no longer had a paying tenant. A for rent sign went up in the window and stayed there, curling and fading in the sun, because no serious tenant wanted to sign a lease for a space burdened with an immovable, decades-old bank vault that the landlord himself had legally claimed as his own property. Vance had spent years threatening tenants with locked doors and legal muscle he didn't actually have, treating that building like his personal kingdom. And in the end, all it took to bring him down a peg was one demand letter, one fake agent's letterhead, and a landlord too greedy and too arrogant to imagine that anyone below him could outmaneuver him at his own game. I left Aaron's office about a year later to finally start my own practice. The last time I walked past that old building, the basement space was still empty, still unrented, still sitting there with 100 tons of steel and a landlord's own signature proving he'd wanted it that way. It's a strange kind of justice, isn't it? Nobody broke a law. Nobody raised their voice, threw a punch, or did anything dramatic. Someone just got exactly what he insisted, loudly and arrogantly, that he wanted, and it cost him everything he actually cared about. If this story gave you that deep, satisfying kind of justice, smash that like button and tell me in the comments. What's the pettiest, most brilliant revenge you've ever seen someone pull off? And if you want more true stories like this one, subscribe, because there's plenty more where a little patience and one well-placed piece of paper brought down someone who thought he was untouchable.